Well, this last Wednesday, we get home from Blast, our kids program here at Trinity, and we get home, and my boy, who's 5, is taking a shower, and I go in just to check on him like I always do, and I go in and I peek on him, and down on his leg is this little black spot. And so I said, "Oh my gosh, Cade, you have a tick again," which is the worst thing to say to Cade at that moment. "You have a tick," and so he goes to do it, and I said, "Don't touch it," and just in the shower, in that moment, Cade just begins to weep. Right? He's screaming. Heather runs in. He's like, "What is going on?" I'm like, "Cade has a tick again, so Cade, don't touch it." And so I go to mess with it, and I'm like, "Cade, that's not a tick. That's a leech." Like, why does Cade have a leech on his leg? Where has my son been that he would get a leech? And so I do what any good dad would do. I go and I get on the computer, and I Google, what do I do to remove a leech? And so I figured out, how do I remove a leech? Still trying to figure out where my son has got a leech from. And so I go into his room, he's crying, and I laying him on the bed, and Heather comes in there, and I get ready to remove this leech, and it wasn't a leech. It was just a little bit of sticky goo, okay? Just a little bit of sticky goo from who knows what that was stuck onto his leg that was about this long, and I assumed tick, leech, completely wrong. Now, this is why I share this. Things are not always as we think they are. Things are not always as we perceive them to be. The story that we're looking at, one of my favorite stories that Jesus tells, so much so we're spending 3 weeks on it, is this story, if we read it just quickly, and many of you, if you've been in the church, have read this, you've heard it several times, you'll maybe miss something in this. You'll miss something. And so my goal for us this morning is to not miss it. Not just to think, well, that's what it's about, and so that's what we're going to assume, but there's going to be much more that we're going to look at today. And for some of you, maybe this will be new. Maybe it will be something you thought about who God is, and maybe you'll see God in a new and different way. So we're looking at the prodigal son story, and it's found in Luke 15. Luke 15. If you don't own a Bible, I say this every week, there are Bibles in the back. And so as you leave today, grab a Bible if you don't own one. We mean that. We want you to take those. That's a gift to you. But Luke 15. And so Jesus is going to start out. We'll look at the first two. I'm just going to highlight where we had been last week, and then we'll jump in and look at the end of it. So chapter 15, verse 1 and 2. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him." And I spent a lot of time last week, and I want to reemphasize this. This is why we're here today. We have come for the sole purpose to gather ourselves around Jesus. Nothing else. I actually even like that we're in the gym. Thank you for being patient with us. Maybe one more week in here and we'll be back into the worship center. But I almost even like being in this space because it's not about a certain space. Like the gospel, the good news of Jesus is spreading around our world into places where there are no buildings for people to gather in. That they've never heard the name of Jesus, and so they're taking in this little bitty contraption and they're showing what's known as the Jesus film. And people are coming to know about Jesus, and it's only about Jesus. Nothing else is getting in the way. And so for a lot of us, it's easy for something else to get in the way. And it no longer becomes just about Jesus. But the tax collectors, the sinners, they are gathered around Jesus. These are the worst of the worst. The tax collectors were the worst of the worst people during that day. It was the people who were pursuing sin. Everyone knew they lived this crazy life, and it was no question that they were sinners. And those were the ones who were gathered around Jesus. But the Pharisees, verse 2, "But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes or brings in sinners and eats with them.'" This is a big deal. This is a very personal thing. This is saying, I accept you, I'm going to be with you. And we talked about that last week. If you missed last week, you can listen to it on our website, or we video our messages. And so I would encourage you to catch up. But here's why it's important. Jesus is upset because the religious leaders are beginning to complain. They're complaining about what Jesus is doing, who Jesus is reaching, who Jesus is spending time with. At one point, they actually called Jesus a drunk and a glutton, because he's always spending time with those people. He wasn't, but that was the perception that the religious people had of Jesus. And so Jesus is going to tell this story because he's hoping to deconstruct what the religious people think about him. And he's going to attempt to reconstruct something new. So he tells 3 stories. He tells the story of a lost sheep that the shepherd goes after. He tells the story of a lost coin that a woman loses, and she tears up her house looking for the lost coin. And then he talks about the parable of the lost son. I'm going to read that, and then we'll break it down. So chapter 15, verse 11. It says, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And so they began to celebrate." Okay, let's hit pause just for a second, just in case you weren't here last week. Just an update. The younger son comes to his father and basically says,
"I wish you were dead. I wish you were dead. I don't need you. I don't want to be in your presence. I don't need your love. I just want your stuff. And so, Father, would you give me what's coming to me?" And so the father should have, all commentaries, all people smarter than me, say that the father had every right to verbally and physically remove his son from the community. That in that time, that would have never happened. A boy would have never come and asked his father for this. And then a father would have never given it. And so the father says, "Yes, here's what you're asking for." And the boy takes his stuff and he goes off to a distant country. And he spends it all. He wastes it all. He squanders it on wild living. And then, when there is nothing left, when he's hit rock bottom, we talked about this last week, some of us have gotten to that place. He comes to his senses and he thinks, all right, I could go back to my father. Everyone who is with my father has everything that they need. I could go back to my father and I'll apologize. I'll ask for his forgiveness. This is super important. He humbly comes back to his father. He recognizes his brokenness. And he comes back to the father. And it says that while the boy is still a long way off, we're going to talk about the father next week, but what a beautiful picture of the father. The father sees him coming and runs out to greet him. He throws his arms around him. I love the picture of him coming back stained and broken, and the father wrapping his loving arms around him. Even in the midst of his sin and his smell, the loving father wraps his arms around his boy and brings him back in. He gives him a robe and a ring and the sandals, and he says, "You're my son, my son." And so, okay, let's catch up. Verse 25. So the younger son, if you haven't got this in the story yet, the younger son represents the sinners, the tax collectors. And so now we're going to look at the elder son, and he's going to represent the Pharisees. It says, "Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" Now, this boy, the younger boy who leaves, it was his plan to never return. I don't know if you were little, if you ever planned on running away, and so you packed a little bag and you threatened to run away, and you got to the end of the driveway and you thought, I have nowhere to go. This younger son wasn't thinking that. The younger son said, I'm gone forever. And so it's easy for us to see the sins of the younger son. We don't have to look far. He physically left the father. He emotionally left the father. He wasted everything he had on wild living. And then he comes back. So it's easy for us to see the problem with the younger son. It's much harder for us to see the problem with the older son. Now let's look at what a Pharisee would have been. Let's jump over. You can save your place if you're looking at it. Let's jump over to Matthew 23. Matthew 23. This won't be on the screen, but Matthew 23. This is Jesus talking to the Pharisees. It says this, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides! You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." Man, the line that jumps out to me about this, and that I've heard this lots, is the idea when he calls them a whitewashed tomb. Now, I don't know if you know this. I'm not necessarily the smartest person in the world, but I never knew that the Taj Mahal was basically a tomb. I don't know if you knew that. But the Taj Mahal is basically a tomb. Here's a picture of the Taj Mahal. It's unbelievable. People come from all over the world to see the Taj Mahal. That if it was built today, it would have cost over $800 million to build the Taj Mahal. But it's a tomb. It's a tomb. People go to look at the majesty of it and the architecture of it. But inside of it houses a dead person. And Jesus is looking at the Pharisees and he's saying, look, you care so much about what people think about you on the outside. You care so much about looking moral, but you're dead inside. You're dead inside. You are like a whitewashed tomb. And so when we think about the way Jesus would talk about Pharisees in this story, you would think that the father is going to give it to the elder son. That he's not going to be kind to him. He's not going to have compassion towards him. But we're going to see something different. Because I really want to ruin the story even before we get too far in it. And that's the idea that both of these boys are lost. They're both lost. So in your Bible, there's probably a header that says the parable of the lost son. There's really two lost boys in this story. And so we see the younger son. That's easy to see, but it's harder sometimes to see the older. And so let's go back through it. Verse 25. It says, "Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing." So let's just time out. I've been to some great parties. I've been to some great weddings lately. Great dances. I'm a pastor, but I dance every once in a while. I'm not very good, but I dance with my kids. But here's what I know. It's hard to hear dancing. And so the story says that the boy hears the party. He hears the music and he hears the dancing. So this isn't just a small family thing that the father is throwing for the boy. The fattened calf would easily have fed 100 people. This is a party of all parties. The entire community would have been at this party, and they would have been amazed at the love of the father. Verse 26. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." So you would think that the son would be ecstatic. The son would be thankful that his younger brother, who has been gone for who knows how long, has come home. They thought that he was dead, that he was left somewhere else, but all of a sudden his boy, the father's son, and his brother has come home. You would think he would be happy and ecstatic. Verse 28, the older brother became angry and refused to go in. Why would he be angry? Why in the world, in this story that Jesus is sharing, why would the elder son be angry? It's as if he sits down like a little toddler, puts his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hands, and he just pouts. Now, what's going on? Here's what I know. The elder son is full of resentment right now. He's full of resentment. And I know from my own life, and I know from speaking with enough people, joy and resentment cannot coincide. Joy and resentment cannot coincide. Resentment is the enemy of joy. I mean, think about for yourself. If there's someone in your life that you have resentment towards them, you know, it's not that you're angry with them, it's just something that's been building. Someone you know that doesn't live like they should be, they don't act like they should, but yet they seem to always be healthy, they seem to always have the right job, it seems like they always have what they need, and you begin to have this resentment towards them, you'll never experience joy for what's happening in their life, ever, as long as you have resentment towards them. And I believe you'll never experience joy for yourself. And so the older brother is full of resentment, and we'll see why here in just a moment. So the older brother becomes angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. This is one of the most important lines, I think, in this whole story. Because we saw with the younger son, the father sees the boy coming and he goes out to meet him. But he does it again. He leaves the party, he leaves the house, and he goes out to find his son. Both of these boys have rejected him. They both have rejected him. And both, I imagine, hurt the father. Yet in the father's love and in his compassion, he goes out to meet both of the boys. So he leaves the party, and you have to understand that probably the people saw the father leave, and they see him go out to the older son, and the father doing something he wouldn't have to do is begging. He's begging the older son to come in. He's saying, look, it's not complete without you. You need to be in here celebrating with us. See, the younger son says that I wish you were dead, give me your stuff. The elder son says, I don't need you either. I don't need you either. I just need your stuff. And we're going to see that right here, verse 29. But he answered his father, look. This would not be a kind term. This is not a respectful way to talk to his father. It's completely disrespectful. He's basically saying, look you. This would have been highly offensive, and people are probably now around them, and he sees again, the crowd sees again one of the boys disrespecting the father. He says this, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. Did you catch it? The elder son does not see himself as a son. So when the younger brother comes back, he in his mind is thinking, look, I could never come back as a son. Maybe he would let me be a hired servant and I'll work my way back into right standing with God. Or with the Father. The Father has to love me because I'll work myself back into relationship with him. And the older son the whole time is doing that. The older son the whole time doesn't see himself as a son, but he sees himself as a slave to the father. That he's obeying, that he's doing what he's supposed to do out of duty, not out of a right relationship with his father. So again, they both want the father's stuff, but they don't want the father. And so it's hard to see this rebellion in the elder son. He doesn't leave. He's never left. He stays there the whole time. He says he's never disobeyed. And like the Pharisees, what he's saying is, outwardly, I've never disobeyed you. I've never gone against what you wanted me to do. He's not thinking about the matters of the heart, but he's saying, look, I've never disobeyed you. Verse 30. But when this son of yours, think of that again, he can't call him brother. This son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home. You kill the fattened calf for him. I love this part in this story because the older son has no idea what the younger son's been doing. He has no idea what the younger son's been doing. He hasn't talked to his younger brother, but he's assuming. He's making a huge assumption of where the younger son has been. Oh, I know where you've been. I know what you've been doing. I know the life that you've been living. And Father, you know that too. How could you bring him back in? And not only could you bring him back in, but you've killed the fattened calf. Now, we talked about this last week. A third of everything the father owned went to the younger son. The rest, the 2/3, went to the elder son. So whose calf was it? It was the elder son. It was his calf that the father takes away and gives to the younger son. We're going to talk more about that next week because as the boy comes home and the father wraps his arms around this prodigal son, this younger son, someone has to pay for it. Someone has to pay, and we're going to look at that next week. But the whole time, this fattened calf was the elder son. And so the elder son thinks, I've followed the rules, Dad. I've done everything I'm supposed to. I've never disobeyed. You owe me, Dad. You owe me. It was coming to me. You couldn't even give me a goat. So his relationship with the father was not a relationship at all. It was just a means to an end. He just wanted something from his dad. And everyone would have been blown away by the way this elder son is speaking to his father. And then you have the father's response. The father has compassion for the younger son, and we're going to see that even now with the character that's playing the Pharisee, the one who is like a whitewashed tomb. Verse 31, my son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. My son, you see yourself as a slave. But the father says, my son, my child, the one I love, everything I have is yours. You have always been with me. This reminds me of in Genesis, the very beginning of the story of creation, when Adam and Eve are created. And Adam and Eve rebel, and they go against what God wanted them to do, and they hide themselves in the garden. And then we see that God comes looking for them. He comes looking for them. And if I'm going to play hide and seek with anybody, I don't want to play with God because God would know exactly where I'm hiding. So Adam is hiding. Adam is hiding full of shame and guilt and regret. And this is what we see. The voice of God says, Adam, where are you? Where are you? Now, I don't think this was a question physically, Adam, where are you? I think it's a question of emotionally, Adam, where are you? Spiritually, Adam, where you had everything you needed. Everything was perfect. Where are you? And I think this is what the dad is saying to the elder son. You've always been with me. Everything I have is yours. And the elder son has not realized it. He hasn't realized it because the whole time he's been working really hard. He's been being really good, thinking this whole time that God has owed him something. The father has owed him something. And so Jesus says, but we had to celebrate in the story, but we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and ends the story there. He's just done. And here's why I think he's done, and a lot of reading and commentaries say that he's done because he's given the Pharisees the opportunity to respond. The thought is, Pharisees, teachers of the law, you have to see yourself in this story. Won't you come home too? The younger son has come home. He rebelled, and he rebelled by being bad. The elder son has rebelled by being good. And the father has come out and said, come home. Come home. And so Jesus has every right to throw down on the Pharisees. And he does a lot of times. But in this story, you can feel Jesus pleading with them. Are you going to welcome the sinners and tax collectors? Are you going to see that you're a lot more like them than you think you are? Are you going to come home? And so he leaves it open-ended, and he does that for us as well. So we looked last week, and a lot of you probably fit the idea of the boy who left. You have rebelled. You have went into this wild living. At some point, you came to your senses, and you came back, and you understand that God's grace was there, and he has brought you home. Some of you maybe are in that moment right now. But I also know the church is full of a lot of elder sons. A lot of elder sons. Those of us who think, I've been good. I've done right. Haven't I received God's love because of what I've done and who I am? And you're just as lost as the younger son. And so 5 things we're going to look at real quick. 5 takeaways. The first one, if you take notes, you can write these things down. The first one, legalism destroys our loving relationship with the Father. Legalism destroys our loving relationship with the Father. And so legalism is this idea of rules over relationships. So I've placed my good works and my good deeds and who I am over my relationship with God. That it's more important that I just do right and I do good and I do everything that's expected of me. That's more important than being with the Father. And so what happens is if we're legalistic is we look at other people that way as well. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. They miss church Sunday. They don't volunteer. They're not doing what they're supposed to. Look how good I am. Look at everything I do. God, aren't you pleased with me? You also have missed out on a loving relationship with the Father because you too have seen yourself like a slave. And if not like a slave, like a hired servant, one who can earn the Father's love. Tim Keller, a lot of what I've learned over the years about this story comes from a guy named Tim Keller. He's a pastor in New York. Wrote a book called The Prodigal God. He says this. He says, the elder brother is not losing the Father's love in spite of his goodness, but because of it. It is not his sins that create a barrier between him and his Father. It's the pride he has in his moral record. It's not his wrongdoing, but his righteousness that is keeping him from sharing in the feast of the Father. The reason the older son doesn't go in is because of his goodness. So he rebels by just being good. And says, look, God, Father, you've never given me what should have come my way. And so he's missing out in this loving relationship. And so if you've been caught up in legalism, then you do because of God's love. You should do good because of God's love for you. Not so that God will love you. So anytime you begin to do something and you think, God must be pleased with me and God must love me more now than he did before I did this, then you've missed it. So we mentor, we read with kids, you volunteer with our children here, you serve the homeless, you work at a nonprofit. You do that because of God's love, not to receive God's love. The moment you begin to do things or to do good works or even to not do bad things is the moment you become an elder son. And you've missed out on a loving relationship with God. He's had complete access to the Father. He's always had complete access for the Father, but he's never taken advantage of it. So the first thing I want you to hear is legalism destroys our loving relationship with the Father. The second thing, Jesus offers a way out of elder son syndrome. Here's what I know, because I've found myself in the place of the role of an elder son. It is exhausting. It is exhausting. And so Jesus says this. This is going to be a translation, a paraphrase. It's found in what's called the Message. It's going to sound a little different. Matthew 11, 28 through 30. Jesus, these are the words of Jesus. Are you tired? Worn out? Burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me, watching how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Are you tired? Are you worn out of always trying to receive God's love? Of keeping scores? Are you tired of the legalistic relationship that you have with the Father? Jesus says, come to him. Come to him. The third thing, what you believe influences how you behave. I've said that a lot for a lot of different teachings, but what you believe influences how you behave. And so the younger son, coming back to the father, believed that he was unworthy of receiving the love of his father. And so he doesn't come back asking the father to restore him into right relationship. And so because he didn't believe a certain way, he behaved a certain way. And it's the same thing with the elder son. Because he believed that the father owed him something, he lived a certain way. He thought he had privileges and that he was entitled. He believed that he was a slave, and so he behaved that way. And so here's how it works itself out with us. And I've sat with people when they've said this to me. When you get sick and you've been good, you've done the right things, or someone you love has gotten sick, and you think, why, God? I've done everything that I'm supposed to do. I've behaved like I'm supposed to behave. Why? When you don't get the job, when your prayers go unanswered, when you struggle just to make it through the week, and you begin to see God and say, all right, God, you owe me something. You owe me. Because you have believed a certain way, you have behaved a certain way. And so if you find yourself today as an elder son, this is often what happens. We obey God to get God's things instead of just getting God. So listen, I want you to never hear me talk about the good news of Jesus and make you believe that if you begin to follow Jesus, everything will go perfectly. That's not true. It's not true. The health, wealth, gospel kind of idea, it's not true. I want you to follow Jesus because you get Jesus. I want you to love God because God loves you, not to get anything from him. And so what that often looks like in church world, we're going to look at these two little things. There'll be a graphic. A lot of times people have looked at the church kind of world as a closed set. And this is what I mean by that. So there's a box, and inside is the cross, and we'll say that represents Jesus. And it's the idea is I just have to be in the box. So I just have to show up on Sundays. I just have to be with the right people. I just have to do the right things. As long as I'm in the box, everything is okay. And so what we do is we begin to say, well, those people are outside the box. Right? And we separate ourselves from us and from them. I'm in and they're out. But what I think Jesus is doing here is he's saying, no, it's not a closed set, it's an open set. And so we eliminate the box. We eliminate the box, and Jesus is still in the center, but the question is, where are you moving? Where are you moving? Are you moving in a right relationship with God? You could be a long way off. You could be here for the first time in a church building in years, maybe for the first time ever. But you may be moving in the direction of Jesus. Some of you, if we're honest, you've been here forever. And you've caught yourself not moving any closer to Jesus. You're just kind of stuck where you've always been. The question that you have to ask yourself is, am I moving in my relationship closer to Jesus? Am I growing in the grace of God? Am I growing in my understanding of who God is? Does Jesus impact and influence every area of my life? Be concerned about the open set. Be concerned about where people are headed. Help people turn in their direction back to Jesus. And you go there as well. The fourth thing. Last week I said that we will be a church. I asked you to help me in this. We will be a church for younger sons. But I'll say this as well. We will be a place for elder sons. We will be a place for those who think they're too far away from God. And will also be a place for those of us who say that in my goodness, God loves me. We'll be a place for all people. I gave you, we're going to look at this painting more next week, but Rembrandt, where you're sitting, there should have been a card there. This is a famous painting from Rembrandt called The Return of the Prodigal Son. We're going to break this down a little bit more next week. There's so much richness in this painting. I'll just real quickly, you could probably figure it out, but you have the father who's embracing the younger son. And again, it's easy to see that the younger son is in a place of need. The dirty white garments that he has on would have been his undergarments. So he literally comes home with just his undergarments. He has no clothes to cover him. His head is shaven. At some point, someone decided that he needed to shave his head as as an act of almost submission, as the picture of working as a hired servant, as a slave. And then you can see on his feet, he only has one shoe, and it's a broken sandal. But again, the father wraps his arms around the son. And it's to the left of the screen, and there's a space between the father and the younger son, and then the man on the right, the elder son, who's standing, watching, observing, hands closed, clasped together, kind of in darkness, just watching. And here's what I know from both of these people. We're going to look at this more next week. And it's what I wrote down there at the bottom. Everyone is wrong. Everyone is loved. And everyone is called to recognize this and change. So whether you find yourself today here as the younger son, you're wrong, but you're loved. If you find yourself here today as the elder son, you're wrong and you're loved. We use the word gospel a lot around here, the good news of Jesus. This is a great way to look at the gospel, is that everyone is wrong, everyone is messed up, but everyone is in need and everyone is deeply loved. The question is, we have to begin to recognize that for ourselves. And number 5, the only prerequisite for receiving the grace of God is to know you need it. The only prerequisite for receiving the grace of God is to know you need it. The younger son in the story knows that he needs it. He comes back broken and says, look, I have sinned against you, Father. I have sinned against heaven. Will you receive me back? Not as a son. He doesn't think he can, but as a hired servant. He knows that he needs something from the Father. And the Father is asking the elder son to recognize it as well. That he's missed it the whole time and that he needs to come in. I think it's interesting, and I'll share this in the end. I think it's interesting that we could think that our goodness or our good deeds or not being bad could put us in right standing with the Father. Like the Father needs anything from us. When we were in California 2 weeks ago, I shared we stayed in this amazing guest house. It was a beautiful place. And into the room where Heather and I stayed were these pocket doors. And so if you know what a pocket door is, they go into the wall, and they were big, huge doors and heavy. And I was away one morning, and I get a call from Heather, and she says, one of the pocket doors just fell off of the slide. I'm thinking, oh, man, that's not good. And so I said, okay, well, I'll try and figure it out. And the whole time thinking, man, I hope the family doesn't come and find us in the middle of the door off of the slide. And so I come home, and Kennedy and Cade, they had been being kids and playing around, and they had pushed into the door, and it had broken off of the track. Now, here's what I didn't do. I didn't go to them and say, okay, you got to fix it. You got to fix it. My 5-year-old son and my 9-year-old daughter, you got to figure it out. You got to fix it. You got to take care of your own mistake. I didn't do that. As their father, I said, look, you made a mistake, but you know what? I'll take care of it for you. I'll fix it for you. I have the ability. I have a way of doing it. And so I fixed the door, and I was thinking about that. That is a picture of grace. That's a picture of grace for you and for me. That there is absolutely nothing you could do in your wrongness and being messed up and your mistakes and even in your goodness. There's nothing you could do to earn the love of the Father. Nothing. Nothing. The Father is offering an invitation for the older son and the younger son. Come home. Come home. Come home. A lot of you today, come home. Experience the real love of the Father. I want to end with that song, Your Love Never Fails. Even when I run away. Some of you have physically ran away. And some of you, like the Pharisees, have in the inside ran away from God. You've gotten so caught up in just doing the right thing. May today be a day where you say, I want to come home. I want to experience the love of the Father. I'm going to pray and have Greg come up. I'm going to encourage you in these moments to reflect where you've been, to stand and sing, to celebrate who God is. Would you stand with me?